Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what's making the headlines with the news editor of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Kate Andrews, and the deputy political editor of HuffPost UK, Owen Bennett. So good evening to both of you. So let's take a look then at what's on the front pages. And keep calm and hurry up is the lead in the Metro, which says that Tory backbenchers are piling pressure on Theresa May, one accusing her of governing like a tortoise. The Express says that Theresa May has been put on notice that she faces the sack if she backslides on Brexit. The Financial Times says that Britain has put itself on a collision course with the rest of the EU by demanding the right to vet any new laws that are brought in during the Brexit transition period. And the Telegraph, meanwhile, carries comments from one minister that Tories who think that Mrs May is selling out over the Brexit divorce bill are being swivel-eyed. The Eye, meanwhile, leads with what it calls shocking figures, which show that children as young as 4 are carrying knives at school. While the Mirror has shock figures of its own, showing that 133 babies every year die while sleeping in the same bed as their parents. The Times says that ministers are being urged to crack down on social media companies over online grooming of young people after 1,300 breaches of the current laws. More shock figures in The Guardian, which reports that hundreds of thousands of young people are living in rented accommodation so squalid that it's putting their health at risk. And The Star says that bookshops are removing the works of comedian David Walliams after he reportedly attended the controversial President's Club dinner that hit the headlines with allegations of sexism this week. So let's get cracking on some of those stories with Kate Andrews and Owen Bennett, and an awful lot of Brexit angles on those front pages, all with a similar theme. Essentially, Theresa May under a lot of pressure to unite her party over the issue. But you've picked out the Financial Times, first of all, which points to some of the pressures she's going to come over in addition this week, given that the EU, for example, is putting forward what it wants from the transition period, isn't it? And the Brexit bill going through the House of Lords, new elements to contend with.
Exactly. It seems like a load of Tory Brexiteers have woken up to what the Florence speech actually said when it talked about a transition period of up to 2 years, which would continue the relationship as we have it now. And they're very angry about this. I don't want to see a lot of things continuing. But tucked in there is some of the things of, OK, we know what the situation is now, but what over those 2 years if the EU tries to bring forward new laws? Do we abide by them? We'll have no say in creating them because we're not part of the institutions. We won't have any MEPs anymore. David Davis used a speech on Friday to say that there could be a means to remedy issues if true to our interests were put forward by the EU. But the EU would say, hold on a minute, you want to create a completely different structure now where you can kind of veto the laws or vet the laws or say they don't apply to you, and that's already a bit of divergence, isn't it? So once again, it's almost like Brexit is a bit more complicated than some people thought.
It was always going to be, though. So we've gotten through phase 1 technically, although I agree with Owen that divergence and alignment are still undefined words in a way, so there will be things we have to come back to there. But even before we get into phase 2, there are already some disagreements which we see here. That's because muddled process, and both sides have to be looking like they're playing hardball and softball at the right times. Oh, yes, we want to negotiate, but we have to stay strong here. And, you know, I don't think it's unreasonable for the UK to suggest that not every single rule that's going to come in that transition period should apply to them. But, of course, the EU wants no scenario where someone who's just voted to leave can block new plans they want to put forward. And the EU is not going to want to wait for 2 years to be able to put through new legislation to affect other countries in the EU. So they'll have to overcome this. But I, for one, am a little bit skeptical these days when we see these stories that almost suggest that things are coming to a halt, to a crashing point. It's going to be like this for the next year. Every step is going to be a negotiation.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's how negotiations work, isn't it? People lay out their positions and they're bound to start off very far apart, and it's just the position that they put in place in order to try and maximise their advantage.
Absolutely. I think you could run these negotiations 100 times and they'll all go the same way because both sides need to fulfil a certain role. The EU can't have it looking too easy to leave the EU because it might encourage other people to do it.
Or to get your own rules.
Exactly. The UK can't be seen to be giving in to everything the EU wants too quickly because then they say, well, you're sort of, you know, giving in to Brussels and this is not a proper Brexit. So both got to kind of dance this dance of trying to get things and give way and all we thought it'd agree by October, we pushed back to December, it's happened the 11th hour, all this kind of stuff. So I think a lot of this is a little bit, you know, for the gallery, a lot of this stuff that's going on.
We also have to remember that if the divorce bill, as it's called, is going to be as high as projected, you know, anywhere up to, what, 50 billion euros potentially, then the EU may end up compromising a little bit more or a little bit less in certain areas depending on that bill, which still isn't finalised. So there's so much to come and it all affects the other parts of it.
But all this conversation is also exercising people within the Conservative Party who, some of whom are fervent leavers, some of whom voted Remain in the first place, and the transition period is one of those, isn't it? And people, Theresa Villiers just today in the papers talking about, you know, Brexit not meaning Brexit.
Exactly.
Her concerns about
and
that.
Jacob Rees-Mogg saying this week that the UK risks being a vassal state for 2 years because we're going to be taking all the rules of the single market and we're not, and all that kind of stuff, and have no say in it. But that, you know, that is kind of what some people would want. Some people would say we should be in that kind of EEA, EFTA-esque kind of relationship with the EU. Some Remainers who for years and years said that's a terrible way to be, being like Norway, and now Nick Clegg saying maybe we should be in that kind of role.
Well, they're grasping at straws in the sense that that is the closest they can now stay in the EU, with still not compromising the democratic vote. But we also must remember it is a 2-year transition period. 2 years is a long time. It's not that you should compromise for anything. But if you're playing a long game here, especially if you're a hard Brexiteer, I would be less concerned about what happens in that transition period and a lot more concerned about how the rules and laws will change after the UK leaves.
OK, let's take in the Daily Telegraph now, because they've got a different angle on the disagreements over Brexit. They're quoting a minister there in their headline saying Brexiteers opposed to EU bill are swivel-eyed.
Yes, so Theresa May has been under a lot of pressure this weekend, coming from all kinds of different directions. She's not hard enough on Brexit. She's too easy on Brexit. She doesn't seem to be pleasing many people within her own party. But this is quite a specific story about a WhatsApp mobile phone message sent by Claire Perry, the energy minister. And it was sent, I believe, to Ben Bradley, who at the time wasn't, but now is the party vice chairman. And in it, there are suggestions that the sellout traitor mob should be ignored, these accusations that those who are trying to compromise, perhaps having a softer take on Brexit, are some kind of traitor, and the hard Brexiteers in this are referred to as swivel-eyed. So very emotional, quite aggressive set of messages here. And I think it's really important to note that the debate is still happening in the UK over what kind of Brexit we're going to have. I mean, we just spoke about how the UK and the EU are negotiating. That has still not been decided at home, and passions are high. Now, these mobile messages are from a few months back, so who knows how things have progressed. But yeah, tensions are very high, and it's reflecting all the way up at the top to the Prime Minister.
Well, that's right, and a lot of talk about some momentum gathering for some kind of leadership challenge. Do you think that is a possibility?
I don't think so, because I still don't think that... Who would want to be Prime Minister now? If you've got ambitions on the top job, you want May to stay in, do all the compromises, do all the hard stuff, and then you come in 2019 and you say, right, Brexit's done, I'm now going to refresh this party, and whoever he or she may be can then lead it to, you know, the sort of sunny uplands of tomorrow. I think to come in now, you're coming in and you're sort of 4-0 down with 10 minutes to go, and no matter what you do, is, you know, you're not going to please everyone. So why come in now? Let her deal with all that kind of stuff. I think it's interesting that the Telegraph is the one that are running on this story when they were the ones famously of, you know, the Brexit mutineers all over their front page, and then you'll see the other side of it now, which is some of the people who you know, on the more Remain side of the argument, also use that kind of language as well, but at least they did it a bit more privately, maybe. But now it's been leaked.
But Theresa May is getting a lot of criticism, isn't she? And some quite outspoken criticism, not just about that she's taking a certain tack, but also over her vision in other areas, and some say lack of dynamism on domestic policy as well. She's taking a lot of flack.
She is, and she is the leader. Responsibility does fall to her, so some of that is obviously deserved. But I have to agree with Owen. Right now, I can't imagine anybody taking the role as being the leader in these Brexit negotiations and not having both sides say, you're the enemy, you're the traitor, you're not going in this direction enough or that direction. So in that sense, it's impossible for her to win. But where she could be winning is on the domestic policy front. The last budget did very little in that area. I don't think people are feeling very inspired. They don't see the direction that this Conservative Conservative government wants to go after Brexit or even during the negotiation. And I mean, the next story highlights it in terms of housing. But, meanwhile, people are struggling and they need help.
OK, and let's move to that next story. Page 2 of The Express, focusing on what Jeremy Corbyn has had to say about Labour's proposals for dealing with homeless people, for helping homeless people.
Yeah, there was a plan about a year ago for Jeremy Corbyn. It was actually about this time last year. To Corbyn to be a bit more freewheeling in his interviews, a bit more Trump-esque was kind of the briefing that we got, in the sense that he would just talk about things that he believed in, and he would kind of think out loud a bit more. And this is one of the things he's done today. I mean, the headline here in The Express will grab posh flats and rough sleepers. It wasn't quite what he said, but he basically looked at the kind of juxtaposition of the rise in homelessness and then the rise in these flats that are laying empty, in these sort of luxury flats. Labour sources after the interview tried to allay fears. It says here that Corbyn was advocating compulsory purchase of private properties, and actually he was criticising the weakening of existing council powers. The Tories, they deemed to weaken these powers. But it's an example of, Corbyn's getting headlines out of housing and homelessness. Now, Theresa May said in her conference speech, the housing crisis is going to blight a generation. She said, after that, I want to be known as someone who fixed the housing crisis. For Sajid Jaber, who's trying to get more money. There's an example of a domestic issue which we know is incredibly important to the generation of people who don't vote Tory, the under 47s. And yet you don't hear anything from the party for that anymore, do you? You don't hear anything from Theresa about that whatsoever.
No, I mean, first-time buyers got a relief on stamp duty. That's about it. I agree with you completely that Corbyn's talking about the right issues. What he's saying, however, is quite frightening. I'm pleased in some ways that he's being more blunt about what he actually believes, because he has very little respect for property rights, talking about power to take over houses that are left empty. If you want to have a debate about whether or not these homes should be more taxed, I mean, fine, but an actual assault on property rights is quite shocking. What frustrates me most about...
You don't agree with it? I agree. I kind of...
About seizing houses?
Yeah,
not a big fan.
Popular policy.
But, well, I'll tell you what really...
Empty houses not been lived in for like 5-10 years?
So, the homes of the ultra-rich in Mayfair, as Alex Weil from the TPA says in his quote here, are not what's causing homelessness. And my frustration is that if Jeremy Corbyn cares at all about homelessness and allowing people to access cheap rent, then he would listen to organisations like the IEA, but not just the IEA, organisations like Shelter, which have the same platform essentially on housing, which is to build more homes. But he doesn't talk about that. He talks about seizing private property, and that's how we know where his true ideological motives come from, and I don't think it's going to help people.
OK, and just to pick out one paragraph in there, it does say that the Conservative Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington said that Tories had pledged to halve rough sleeping by 2022 and end it by 2027.
Yeah, but I pledged to lose 2 stone this year, so, we can all make promises,
Right, well, we will be doing a weigh-in now and at the end of the year. But in the meantime, I'm going to take a break. Coming up after the break, Donald Trump tells the UK to be tough in EU talks. We'll have more on that. You're watching the press preview. With me tonight, Kate Andrews and Owen Bennett, and we're going to talk Donald Trump. He's inside the Daily Express. A picture there of his interview with Piers Morgan, about which every journalist, I think, is very jealous. That Piers Morgan has clinched this interview. So tell us a little bit about what this article focuses on, what he said.
Well, yeah, quite an opportunity to interview Donald J. Trump. So the article is leading with Trump's comments about the EU negotiations. Trump, unsurprisingly, is saying that he would be a stronger, more direct negotiator. He doesn't go into those details, but the quote here is that he would have a tougher attitude than the Prime Minister. He goes on, however, to say that he has a great relationship with the Prime Minister and he thinks she's been doing a good job. So it's not supposed to be a jab at her, but probably rather a boast as to what we know Trump likes to praise himself for, which is being a good negotiator. My favorite quote in this, out of this particular article, is, "I know the British people and understand them." I'm very excited to see how the British people react to that quote. Owen, you're British.
Well, megalomaniac, self-obsessed, out of his depth, but give credit to Piers Morgan. He got the interview. And, he's keen to talk about what a good friend he is of President Trump. Fine, whatever. And this interview talks, Trump talks a lot about how he would handle negotiations with the EU. I mean, I would love to have seen that. I mean, this is a guy who 1 minute says, America first and all this kind of stuff, and talks about basically about protectionism. And then he says, I'm going to be there, I don't want to cause any difficulty. if your country talks about with, and he talks about how he's going to be really together with the UK and he's going to help us out on trade deals, which I just don't believe. I just don't think he's going to do that. I think he says whatever comes into his mind. I don't think he necessarily carries through with it.
Yes, he does have the tendency to contradict himself. I mean, he goes pretty hard on the EU and trade, and he's referring actually to the trade with America. We know that the president doesn't like what he calls trade deficits. And of course, trade deficits can be very good for the consumers in the country who are getting cheaper imports and are able to buy them. The president doesn't focus on that. So he clearly has decided now he's a Brexiteer. But yeah, I mean, again, it's not really framed from the UK's perspective. It's framed from how Donald Trump would handle things as Donald Trump being Donald Trump.
But what I would say is when he says here that Brexit happened mostly, you said, because of trade, but mostly because of immigration, I think he's completely right. There's a lot of people in the Brexit movement who are now trying to rewrite the Brexit campaign, the referendum campaign, as being all about trade. It wasn't. The official Vote Leave group, they ran an immigration-based campaign. The unofficial ones, they ran immigration as well.
Wasn't that key to it?
Sovereignty as well, but it was mainly on immigration, because immigration was used as the example of sovereignty. But the idea that this was all about trade, and people walking around going, we must be at the customs union so we can sign our own trade deals. It's just,
does anyone say it's all about trade?
There are people in the Brexit movement who have convinced themselves retrospectively that the immigration didn't play that big a part. I think they're deluding themselves.
I think there are people who would like to focus now more on trade because it's the more positive outlook. But of course, immigration was a big focus of it. Yeah.
OK, let's move on to the front page of the Times tomorrow morning. They're talking about social media firms being told to crack down on grooming on their front page.
Yeah, there's a new offence, the offence of sexual
Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview. That's our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be chatting about the headlines with the news editor for the Institute of Economic Affairs, Kate Andrews, and the deputy political editor of HuffPost UK, Owen Bennett. So hello to both of you. So let's take a look then at what's on the front pages. And keep calm and hurry up is the lead in the Metro, which says that Tory backbenchers are piling pressure on Theresa May, one accusing her of governing like a tortoise. The Express says that Theresa May has been put on notice that she faces the sack if she backslides on Brexit. The Financial Times says that Britain has put itself on a collision course with the rest of the EU by demanding the right to vet any new laws that are brought in during the Brexit transition period. The Telegraph, meanwhile, carries comments from one minister that Tories who think Mrs May is selling out over the Brexit divorce bill are being swivel-eyed. The Eye leads with what it calls shocking figures which showed that children as young as 4 are carrying knives at school. The Mirror has shock figures of its own, showing that 133 babies every year die while sleeping in the same bed as their parents. The Times says that ministers are being urged to crack down on social media companies over online grooming of young people after 1,300 breaches of the current laws. More shock figures in The Guardian, which reports that hundreds of thousands of young people are living in rented accommodation so squalid that it's putting their health at risk. The Star says that bookshops are removing the works of the comedian David Walliams after he reportedly attended the controversial President's Club dinner that hit the headlines over allegations of sexism this week. The Daily Mail leads with a study which found that 2 out of 3 teenagers feel bombarded by TV adverts for betting firms. While The Sun says that Brits abroad can finally beat the Germans to the Sunbeds by booking them online in advance. Yes, that really is their main story, and we are talking about it a little bit later. In the meantime, though, Kate Andrews and Owen Bennett, proper welcome. And let's turn our attention to Brexit, because as we saw there on a lot of the front pages, at least, with a similar take on it, a lot of the papers, the Metro says keep calm and hurry up. Who's saying this?
This is Robert Halfon, who was a former education minister, who was sort of sacked by Theresa May for no real reason when she became Prime Minister, and he's always sort of wondered why this happened. He's someone who very much talks about how the Tories should represent the workers of the country, should represent the white van man and woman.
Yes.
That's what he says. And he wants to see the party sort of rebranded, and he thinks that basically policy making by tortoise is the way that Theresa May is going, and everything's a bit too slow. Not just with Brexit, but with other things. She made a big thing in her conference speech, that ill-fated conference speech about housing, how she wanted to tackle that on the steps of Downing Street, when she talked about how she wanted to help sort of working-class white boys in particular do better at school. These are things you rarely, if ever, hear anything about now, because it is all about Brexit. Brexit is the logjam. This is exactly what Tony Blair warned about when he said that Brexit is going to take every inch of matter in government. They're going to be focusing on this. And you see this now. You see the government which is sort of in a state of paralysis, because all it can do is think about Brexit.
And try and sort out divisions within her own party and cabinet on the issue.
Well, exactly. I do think that we're in a bit of a Brexit black hole at the moment, but that's also made worse by the fact that there is still not a clear path as to what kind of Brexit the UK will be pursuing. Not within the Conservative Party, certainly not between the Conservative Party and Labour, not at all. And so these internal debates are playing out in a very public way, especially as we negotiate with the EU. But the reality is that you have the Chancellor saying, we're going to try really hard not to deviate from the customs union last week. And then you have the hard Brexiteers who thought we had already agreed to leave the single market and the customs union saying, what on earth is going on? And that's all coming together and weighing on Theresa May's shoulders. You know, when she didn't win her majority, she lost a lot of credibility. And now it seems that everything that goes wrong is going to be her fault. She's the leader, so she has to take responsibility at the top. But I'm not convinced that she could make anybody happy right now, because she's always not doing enough of this or not doing enough of that on Brexit.
And in the meantime, as this article says, her de facto deputy, the Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington, was on Andrew Marr's show this morning telling everyone to pull together, which sounds, you know, some people say a little bit desperate, appealing to MPs on television.
It's a strange state of affairs. You have that, like you said, you've got the Chancellor talking about one version of Brexit, which doesn't sound like Brexit at all. You've got Jacob Rees-Mogg then going around sort of, you know, making sure that Cabinet are aware that there is this caucus within the Tory party who are very keen for Brexit to be delivered in full and as quickly as possible. And then you've got David Lidington going out trying to keep everyone together. It doesn't seem a particularly sensible way to be running the government, to be having these divisions out in the open. And again, it's always over Europe with the Tories.
And let's turn inside the Mail as well, the Daily Mail, because they've got an article which focuses again on the same quote, more like a lion than a tortoise, and it goes into some of the details of the divisions, isn't it?
So divisions are just all over the place. So the Chief Whip, Julian Smith, is going to be meeting with the European Research Group, which is the one that Jacob Rees-Mogg is now leading as chairman, which is the group that's coming forward at this particular time to say that Mrs May is not going far enough to deliver a clean Brexit. And of course, the Conservative Party has been very clear that it respects the vote of the referendum. It will be leaving the EU. But this is where the hard Brexiteers want to have their say. I think they felt glazed over, really, in phase one. They think the divorce bill is too high. They think that the Prime Minister is going to be too weak during the transition period. And in this phase two, this crucial time of negotiating trade deals and negotiating what happens in the transition period, they want their voices heard. And it looks like they're willing to risk a lot to make sure they are.
And we are going to get progress this week in terms of hearing what the EU wants from the transition period. It's first kind of a document, if you like, laying out what they want. We've also got the Brexit bill heading to the Lords as well, so there's more pressure coming from other angles as well on this.
There's more examples of Theresa May to either show or not show leadership. David Davis said in his speech on Friday he wanted all this transition implementation period agreement all sewn up by the summit in March. It's a pretty quick turnaround, especially if you then want to move on to the trade deal after that. There was a lot of pressure to get this done. The European Research Group, which Kate talked about, which Jacob Rees-Mogg was the chairman of, the previous two chairmen, Steve Baker, Suella Fernandez, have both been made ministers in the Brexit department now. I think that Jacob Rees-Mogg does not want to be minister in the Brexit department. I think he's thinking higher than that. I think he wants to be in government at the top, having a real say in these decisions.
You mean he wants to take over from Theresa May?
I don't think that. I think he wants to be, I think he's a kingmaker, because at the end of the day, he's got this caucus of 60 MPs,
it's a lot.
Which he can instruct who to back in the next, if there is a leadership election, and he'll want some kind of reward for that. The way that he took David Davis down at the European Select Committee, Brexit Committee, last week, suggested to me this was not a man who was trying to win David Davis's favour. This was a man who was trying to catch the eye of people who want a certain kind of Brexit.
And on the subject of a leadership contest, will it happen? There's been a lot of muttering that people who aren't happy are pushing for one.
I don't think there's going to be one. I don't think there needs to be one now. I think why would you want to take over now at this crucial point in the negotiations? And actually, Theresa May, at the moment, is a bit like me with my three sisters when I was growing up. My parents said, well, if you're all annoyed, I know I'm probably doing something right. And that's probably Theresa May's way at the moment. She's thinking, well, look, if everyone's equally as annoyed with me,
sure,
then maybe it's just I'm doing everything right. If one side starts feeling happier than the other, that's when you might see a shift come and people trying to get rid of her. But at the moment, I think people are sort of keeping it on the even keel.
OK, let's move on to the front page of The Guardian now with a completely different story. They claim it as an exclusive, and they're talking about the state of some rented accommodation. They focus particularly on young people, I think, and say that they're enduring conditions that are actually
hazardous. Yes, they call it hazardous, mold, rats. I mean, really ugly stuff. They estimate that 338,000 properties rented to young people in particular are hazardous. I'm not surprised they're focusing on young people. They tend to have less income, less cash on hand. They're not going to be able to afford the higher rents. And they're also pointing out that the worsening housing shortage and rents has increased by 15% over the past 7 years in the UK. It is shocking, but it shouldn't be that shocking given what we know about the current situation with housing in the UK. There's very limited supply. People are certainly downgrading, I'm sure, so that they can just get something, so they have somewhere to live. And they're compromising to live in these terrible situations. It is really important to point out that tenants do have rights. I mean, you're not legally allowed to rent out apartments or bedrooms like this. So one of the things that isn't in the story that I'd love to know is how many people here followed up with their landlords and perhaps were refused and took this up legally. But yeah, it's deeply concerning. When you don't have any choice, you end up settling for something that you don't deserve. And that's what we're seeing with such a limited supply of housing.
I know from when I've lived in places, and unfortunately some of the things they discuss here rings true to me, my experience living in rented accommodation. You feel like even if you complain to the landlord, they ignore you, they don't do anything, you don't know then where to go next. And even if you were going to some kind of ombudsman, you're still living in someone's house. You think that relationship's then been damaged with the landlord. You fear they might just chuck you out. So there's a lot of sort of dynamics at play here. But I think it would be good to have some kind of independent ombudsman you could directly, sort of complain to, say, come round and look at my house, and they can issue a kind of notice, a fixed penalty notice almost to the landlord. If you don't get this sorted out within 2 weeks, within a week, then we're going to come round and we're going to fine you even more.
And housing, obviously, a massive issue on lots of different levels. Let's see if we can squeeze in one more story before the break, though. The Times' main story, they're focusing on social media firms and the issue of grooming.
So they found that more than 1,300 allegations of children being targeted in breach of new laws around grooming are happening on these big platforms like Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram. Horrifying stuff. I think these companies do need to take more responsibility and they need to look at their own guidelines to see how they can help crack down on this. I'm slightly concerned, however, about the proposals being put forward that AI could be used to target people sending inappropriate messages, given the fact that we live in a day and age where, newspaper outlets hire journalists to track people with records of pedophilia or grooming. I just feel deeply nervous about someone innocent, especially through AI measures that aren't fully tested, being put in a position where they're getting these accusations, or, as this article notes, even in a position being referred to the police. So we have to be very careful when we're looking at people's personal messages that they're sending through a source that they think is personal, might be totally consensual. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to be on Facebook if I knew that they were nonchalant about issues of child grooming. I think most people feel that way.
And do you feel that more needs to be done, more responsibility needs to be taken by people that are, companies that are hosting, give platforms to potential paedophiles? Well,
whenever I come and do this fantastic paper review, which I love doing, it seems we're always talking about an issue like this, whether of this kind of nature of social media companies, their platforms being used for legal activities, be it to sell drugs or in this case for grooming, and just not enough being done by the companies themselves. And I'm not sure how many more guidelines and how many more sort of voluntary things they've got to sign up to until something actually is done to make a change.
OK, and yes, and in the meantime, a lot of the papers are putting the pressure on, aren't they?
Yes.
Seeing themselves in competition in some ways as well. We're going to take a break. Lots more to talk about, including wish you were hair, it says. I think you can guess what they're doing there. The Sun reports how Brits abroad finally have a way to beat the Germans to the sunbeds. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me tonight, Kate Andrews and Owen Bennett, and we're turning our attention to the front page of The Sun. I'm going to let you explain this one.
I'm struggling to work out what this is a story, but basically, a company, I think it's Thomas Cook, is offering people the chance to book their sunbeds when they go on their holidays now to stop the cliche of the Germans getting the sunbeds first. And a couple of papers have brought up this kind of German stereotype. I had to explain to my American friend here what this was all about.
I thought you were going to say Canadian for a second.
No.
You did really well.
But this is, I don't understand this. This is nuts, right? Because I've been on holiday in Europe loads of times when you can book your sun lounger. I don't understand why this is new.
I have to say, I didn't know that.
Okay, you say you don't understand why it's news, but in the green room, I heard this big scoff, and I turned to Owen and I was like, oh my gosh, what's in the headlines? And it was this story, and clearly you had an emotional reaction, so it is a headline.
And you're still trotting out this Germans are trying to
It's very weird.
get stuff.
It is very
How
weird.
do German people reading this feel?
I would think quite offended. I don't get it, but I mean,
What's the equivalent in America to the Germans?
Not if a headline like this with one of our neighbours, I guess we can be quite mean about the Canadians, frankly, but they're mean right back.
What are they going to do?
They're mean right back, and they do interviews with Americans and try to make them look silly, so it's a bit more banterous, I'd say.
OK, let's move on to Donald Trump inside the Daily Mail. Obviously, we got confirmation that Donald Trump is heading to Britain, even though he'd cancelled the trip to open the American embassy. He is on his way, and their headline there suggesting that lovies are threatening the biggest ever protest.
Yeah, so the campaigning coalition Stop Trump has vowed to make this the largest rally that Britain has ever seen. It's already being organised. Trump now has said, although Theresa May has not confirmed it, that he's been invited twice to come to the UK this year, once on a state visit, and I have to assume the other on a working visit, though it's not specified. Now, this keeps getting delayed. He was supposed to come last year, he's supposed to come early this year, so let's see if it pans out. But if he does, he's going to have apparently thousands upon thousands of people protesting him. And I think protest is a wonderful thing. It's a mark of a free society. And you know what? The president, while he did apologize for retweeting the Britain First tweets, has a lot of other things to apologize for. So I think it's important that people are vocal about what he's done wrong. I hope that it's used in a productive way. And that it isn't just about sort of, bashing the way people voted or bashing the direction America's taking, but actually about the president and the wrongs that he's committed.
Yeah, I mean, the Mail have called it lovies. Lovies here is anyone in the creative arts industry who's got an opinion on politics, which, as we know, is the worst thing in the world, apparently, according to some newspapers. So they're bashing the lovies, getting involved. People like Stephen Fry, they talk about here. There's some MPs, Stella Creasy, David Lammy. And I think, I agree with Kate, the problem with these protests wonderful at demonstrating a strength of feeling in the country. And I went on the anti-Iraq war one in 2003, and I remember that sense of seeing people from all walks of life on this march, and really getting a sense that people from everywhere were opposed to this thing. But then they just get hijacked by people with another political steer, whether it's the left, which it often is the far left in these situations, and that's what quite kind of turns you off about these marches a little bit. People might come out and are opposed to Trump and opposed to what he represents, but it doesn't mean they want to see the overthrow of capitalism as we know it, and they want to see, an end, they want to see pacifism across the world and we should all lay our guns down. That's a completely different thing. And it does annoy me sometimes that these things get sort of co-opted by these groups.
Yeah, absolutely.
OK, let's move on to the front page of The Mirror, which has quite a striking front page, saying that 133 babies die when they sleep with their parents in bed with them. Yeah,
The Mirror are claiming that these are the first statistics on co-sleeping deaths. As any parents know, or expecting parents know, you get conflicting advice about what to do with a newborn baby, whether they should sleep in bed with you or not. Some mothers like to have the babies in bed because then they can breastfeed while they're still asleep, and that's a way of stopping interruptions and getting out of bed. You hear different stuff from the NHS to your NCT class, to your friends who've had babies. It is a very, very confusing time. And this it highlights the dangers of it. But there'll be plenty of people out there who would have slept with their babies and will say it was absolutely fine and they had no problem at all.
Yeah.
So it does show that there is this real mixture of information about it. And being a parent, being a new parent, it is a hell of a confusing thing to be.
Yeah.
And this is another example of the dangers there are.
It's a brave thing to be, too.
Let's whiz on to a story that we were talking about quite a lot in the break, I have to say. The fact that Meghan Markle has decided that she will speak at her wedding, according to
She is. She's going to give a speech, and I think this is wonderful. Meghan's American. I'm American, and in America, it's not strange at all for the bride to give a toast or a speech at the wedding, whereas traditionally in the UK, that's not as heard of. And so I think it's wonderful that she's bringing this tradition over the pond. I don't want to get up on a feminist high horse about it. I just think it's a really great example about how you can make your wedding your own and certainly empower both the bride and the groom.
Hurrah for her. We're actually out of time, but I'm assuming that you think it's marvellous.
Well, you never know now. But yes, yes, I do.
Thank goodness we know. Owen and Kate, always good to see you. Thanks both very much indeed.